Well, it looks like the scalper's days were numbered after all. With the re-release of the NES Classic Edition, there was a game that caught my eye, and that game was Startropics. Could it be? Yes, because the Legend of Zelda inspired Genyo Takeda. Forgive me if I mispronounced that. Startropics was developed by Nintendo's research and development team, in which they worked on mostly hardware, with Takeda being a key person and the game designer for Punch-Out! Oddly enough, the game was developed in Japan but was released only in North America and Europe. I would say Zelda is a good game to take inspiration from because Zelda is one of my favorite game series. In fact, that is what inspired my name, in case you didn't catch the reference in my logo. But enough of that. This is my review of Startropics. Like in old NES fashion, what you need to know about the story is in the instruction manual. The game's protagonist is a star baseball pitcher from Seattle, Washington, known as Michael, aka Mike Jones. Mike Jones receives a letter from his uncle. His uncle's name is Steve, although most people call him Dr. Jones, who is an archaeologist. I am totally not thinking of Indiana Jones right now. What Dr. Jones is doing is looking for ruins in the Coral Sea. The next day, Mike visits his uncle. By the way, he's actually never met him, via helicopter. And that's where the game starts. On a helipad during a summer day at Sea Island. Our young hero makes his way to a village known as Coca-Cola, which sounds like a spoof of Coca-Cola except tropical. There are a lot of villages in this game named after soda, so... Upon entering the village, he meets the chief of the village, who is also a good friend of Dr. Jones. By the way, they still call the protagonist Mike, even though I named him Isaac. The chief informs the teenage hero that his uncle has been abducted. By who exactly? Well, it hasn't been stated at this point yet. The chief gives Mike what is called a star. The star is basically a yo-yo that works like a sword in this game. Sounds about as practical as Sora swinging a giant key around. But hey, it gets the job done. Instead of saying it's dangerous to go alone, the chief says that monsters have been lurking around the islands the past few years. Mike then makes his way to the chief's sister, who is also a shaman. She says that Mike's uncle was abducted because he found the secret of the lost ruins. She has a lot of faith in Mike and says that just like Mike's yo-yo, sailors look for the Southern Cross. What is the Southern Cross? Well, it is vaguely stated that it is magic. And then in Zelda terms comes the first dungeon of the game. The graphics change in a sort of similar fashion like in Final Fantasy VII, where there are chibi models out on the field, and in battle the character models are not chibi style. Other people may like to compare this game to the first Zelda on the NES, but I like to think of it as more like Terra Enigma and Chrono Trigger to an extent in terms of gameplay. Outside dungeons, Mike can only traverse through the world map and towns where he could talk to villagers. In dungeons is where you can use your weapons. In the first room are these slug things called jellies. You kill all the jellies, it opens the door to the next room. Also, when you defeat an enemy, they sometimes drop stars as well as hearts. Collect 5 stars and you refill a heart. Collect 1 heart and you fill a heart. In the occasional secret room, you would find either a set of hearts or a potion. This game has grid-based movement. Personally, I do find it to be a little awkward. When he goes in one direction and then turns in another, he sort of slides before going in another direction. I guess kind of like sliding to a base in baseball. Other times his movement pauses before turning a different direction. Anyway, back to the dungeon at hand. A couple of rooms later are platforms. You may have noticed these in the first room, in the middle of this body of water. In the case of this room, you jump on the platform that reveals a switch, and jumping on that switch opens the door to the next room. If you fall in the water, however, it is a one-hit KO. I personally wish it wasn't so because some dungeons have quite a bit of water in them. I'd rather it be just lose a life and start at the door you came from. Being KO'd sends you back either to the beginning of the dungeon or a previous checkpoint. You have your hearts and you have your lives. If you lose all of your hearts, you lose a life. If you lose all of your lives, you start at the beginning of the dungeon. In this room, there is a chest. Opening it gives a power-up, and in this case, fire. With the push of the select buttons, you change items. Only the yo-yo, however, is what stays in your inventory. Everything else has limited usage. The first boss of a game, which is known as the Sea Serpent, it's a very simple fight, really. Just dodge his short bursts of fire breath, spam your fire when his mouth is open, and he is a goner in no time. That is the general structure of dungeons in this game. So I won't go into too much more detail when I talk about the other dungeons. When you leave the dungeon, you meet with Dr. Jones's assistant who gives you the code to work in the submarine known as Subsea. You enter the laboratory only to be greeted by Rob in the submarine. Remember that passcode you were given? Yeah, there's no need to write that down, unlike those long passwords in some other NES games. Mike then heads out on a voyage to meet a dolphin who asks him to help her son. Mike then docks at a tropical island in which here introduces the ability to go through tunnels. If a tunnel is not facing the screen, water will ripple right by it, letting you know you can pass through it. After a couple of hints from a husband and wife, who for some strange reason allows a random teenage boy into their house while the wife is alone at home, Mike then comes across a letter in a bottle that says his uncle was abducted by aliens. I totally did not see that coming. The letter has an ID code for the submarine which allows it to now go underwater in areas marked. The player could traverse through another dungeon with lots of water and jumping on platforms. It is here the player can pick up a home run bat which can one-hit kill enemies as well as cover more of the area in front of him. It is in this dungeon that Mike finds the missing dolphin. It is after freezing the water where this giant Octorok is. Mike defeats it and then rescues the dolphin. The mother of the young dolphin thanks him for saving her son, and the dolphin family lead our hero to his next destination. Mike was out at sea when all of a sudden the weather started getting rough. The subsea was tossed. If not for the courage of the fearless crew, the subsea would be lost. The subsea would be lost. Mike then goes to find help for his submarine. In Miracola, Mike speaks with the chief in which he asks Mike to help his daughter. Mike then sets out to find help for the chief's daughter, in which at this point, enemies start to hit a little harder. More on that later. This dungeon in particular has a room in the dark to where you have to figure out where to jump to for solid ground. Also in this dungeon, there is lava which behaves just like water. You die once you jump in. At the end of this dungeon lies a boss, where you beat him Donkey Kong style. Mike then goes to meet a fortune teller who does not have her crystal ball. So Mike then proceeds to help recover her crystal ball. Mike does so by taking this route through the mountains and finds himself in a graveyard. Underneath one of the graves is another dungeon that Mike has to go through. This dungeon has a bit of a design flaw, however. When you find a room with sets of hearts in this level, the door locks behind you and you have to take the stairs back to the graveyard. And then re-enter the dungeon and start from the beginning. Yeah, good level design, sure. I personally feel like I ran through this level over and over again, but it did introduce an item that lets you see ghosts, kind of like the Lens of Truth in Zelda. You see how Mike's getting attacked by absolutely nothing here? That's because he's being attacked by a ghost. There is also this mirror item that lets you defeat whiz robes. I found it fun to use this item. I definitely enjoyed using the Rod of Sight to reveal the boss and using the mirror to defeat it. Oh yeah. Mike then proceeds to the end of the dungeon where he drains the lake and naps the crystal ball. Mike then returns the crystal ball to She-Cola where the fortune teller is. Just like Gerudo Valley in Zelda and Troya in Final Fantasy IV, She-Cola is a women's only city. And speaking of Zelda, Mike had to cross-dress to get in. Michelle, meets with the Queen of She-Cola. Mike tells the Queen that he needs to meet with the Mountain Hermit to help the daughter of the chief in Miracola. And Mike gets away with being a girl and gets an upgraded yo-yo called the Shooting Star, which lets Mike fire projectiles with it if he has 6 red hearts. Mike then talked to the head warrior to gain the secret to accessing the Mountain Hermit. Mike then meets with the Hermit for him to give Mike the Scroll of Obob. Mike runs back to Miracola to heal the chief's daughter. After that, Mike's submarine gets repaired with the help of the villagers, and off he goes to his next destination. Until he gets swallowed by a whale. Inside this whale, he meets his uncle's assistant, in which he tells Mike that he witnessed the kidnapping and that he was abducted by a UFO. Mike, using his submarine, navigates the inside of the whale trying to figure a way out. It's like a dungeon, except it is not in this game's dungeon mode. Mike then finds a lighter, returns to his uncle's assistant, sets his raft on fire, and then the whale sneezes them out. Mike was then told by his uncle's assistant that he must dip his uncle's letter in water. Man, do you remember those days when games came with instruction manuals? I remember I used to look through manuals just for the heck of it. This one in particular came with a letter. When you actually dip this letter in water, it reveals invisible ink. It reveals a hidden message from Mike's uncle, which is important for this part of the game. If you are playing the Virtual Console version, you can use the operations manual for this. If you played this on the NES Classic like I did, it has the secret message already uncovered by the electronic manual, which can be viewed on your electronic device. Or a simple Google search will give the answer. It's not cheating if you don't have the letter. With the secret code inputted in the submarine, Mike then goes to look for his uncle, only to have his path blocked by a ship. So instead of going around the island, he decides to remove it himself. After Mike gives the parrot a worm, the parrot gives Mike a hint to opening the captain's cave. So after solving a music puzzle, Mike goes through another dungeon where bowling balls kill with one hit. Don't you love it when that happens? After getting this machine to work, the ship sinks. Mike proceeds to look for his uncle around a series of islands thanks to Rob's signal, doing a few long jumps, and then finds a large rock. More on that in just a bit. After using this awesome item called the Twin Crossblades, which separate into 2 projectiles with the push of a button on some statues shooting flames, Mike finally meets his uncle. Yay! Mike's uncle then proceeds to tell him the story of the large rock. On a faraway planet called Argonia, the Argonians battled the aliens. The Argonians lost and they sent their escape pod to Earth, which is the big rock or what's left of the escape pod anyway. Mike's uncle then tells him of 3 cubes from the escape pod in which he states were very important, without telling him why. Mike's uncle then tells him to go get the cubes back from the aliens. Yeah, that's good supervision. Also, what kind of person asks for a favor to someone whom he hasn't talked to in a while, let alone never met? Hey, I'm your uncle. It's very nice to meet you. Hey, do us all a favor and get these 3 cubes back from the aliens. It will be very dangerous, but I think you can handle it. Oh, and you might die. Unlike the game that inspired this, Startropics is pretty linear. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, even though Final Fantasy XIII gives the word linearity a bad reputation. By the way, I actually liked Final Fantasy XIII. But it is here that the level design decides to be more open. I would not have a problem with this. In fact, I love exploring in games. What's wrong with the non-linearity here is there is no map to pull up. When I look up online on how to bring up the map of this game, it just brings up the layouts of all the dungeon maps. I did not have a problem with having no map until this point in the game. Not only do you have to kinda guess where you need to go, assuming you do not use a guide, but the enemies here hit hard. And these guys come out of nowhere. You do come across this pill that would give you the maximum amount of health temporarily, but still. I will say the music is pretty catchy though. Also, after passing this section of the dungeon, it does revert back to its linear structure in the next sections. Nice to see some consistency again. Mike also gets the Supernova, the best yo-yo in the game. That's really cool. After Mike grabs 2 of the cubes, the spaceship lifts off in good old NES fashion. It is now time to grab the final cube and defeat the game's primary villain, Zelda. The developers really liked Soda, didn't they? I'm not complaining, I like soda too. My favorites are Mr. Pibb and Root Beer. Mike then proceeds to defeat Zelda. After he's had to defeat the first version of him almost dying. Seriously, I start here with 3 lives again. I have to defeat him without getting hit. And then destroying the ship's power source. And then finally, the final showdown with Zelda, which he now looks like something off of Metroid. Mike then proceeds to use his yo-yo while avoiding these things Zelda keeps throwing up, gross, and not touching him. Mike then gets the last cube and falls into the ocean. It's okay because a dolphin helps him get back to Sea Island. Mike reunites with his uncle, returning the 3 Argonian cubes. With a celebration, the 3 cubes join together and the surviving Argonians appear. The Argonians are welcomed to the islands and were taken in to stay as their new home. The game then ends with a view in space and a reflection of the adventure. As far as NES games go, I would say Startropics is a pretty competent Zelda clone. I would say this game is more combat oriented, whereas The Legend of Zelda is more puzzle oriented. Kind of like how Oracle of Seasons is more action oriented, whereas Ages is more puzzle oriented. Forgive me if I make a lot of comparisons to the original Zelda, but in some ways, I like this game more than that game. What I liked was the world was civilized. The original Zelda only had enemies and people who live in caves. The story was simple like most NES games, but I like how the story was more involved in this game than other NES games. I would say this game and the original Final Fantasy had pretty good stories for an NES game. The game was enjoyable without a guide, unlike the original Zelda. Some of the items were awesome, such as the ability to long jump, the twin crossblades, the spikes that nuke the screen, and the miracle mirror. What I thought could have been better was, I think the aesthetics of the dungeons could have been more varied besides the items and enemies. The game doesn't look bad by any means. I do like the character portraits though. And the end where enemies hit hard, and some even kill instantly. And a section of a dungeon where I wish I had an in-game map. With that being said, I give this game a 7 out of 10. It is a good game that I think could be enjoyed by both nostalgic fans, as well as a modern audience who picked up the NES Classic Edition. If you're a fan of the action-adventure genre, own an NES Classic Edition, or the original NES, it might be worth it for you to try out. Another option is the Wii U Virtual Console. With that being said, thank you all for watching, take care, and I will see you for my next review.